The Velton estate sat like an afterthought at the farthest reach of Harrow's end, where the cobbled road thinned into dirt and the hedgerows grew high enough to shadow the sun. It was not a grand home by aristocratic standards, but it had a certain stubborn dignity. 3 floors of gray stone, narrow windows like watchful eyes, and gardens that seemed too carefully tended for a place so far from the bustle of town. To anyone passing on a winter morning, the sight of frost clinging to its ivy walls would seem ordinary. But the air here carried a strange weight, as if sound itself bent away from the property. It was in that winter of 1897 when the first unease took root, though in truth the ground had been prepared for much longer. The Veltons were known by all, though understood by none. Alaric Velton was a tall, deliberate man with pale hands and a voice that never strayed from a lilting rhythm. His wife, Prudence, possessed a soft smile that seemed permanently fixed, as if her lips had forgotten how to rest. Their 3 children, all under the age of 12, spoke in sing-song phrases, their rhymes so constant it was hard to know when they were speaking truth or reciting something they had been taught. When asked why they never spoke plain, Prudence would only reply with a couplet, the words sliding into the air like warm milk, sweet at first, unsettling after. The villagers dismissed it as eccentricity. Rural England was dotted with strange families, and the Veltons were at least polite. Yet some swore that if you listened too closely, their rhymes carried a cadence like prayer, not the holy kind, but something older, stripped of mercy. That winter was colder than most, the kind that held the earth hard and unforgiving. On the morning of the first disappearance, a milkman making his rounds found something curious on the post outside the baker's shop. A folded slip of paper pinned neatly under a small silver button. The paper bore a child's handwriting, looping and uncertain, but the words formed a rhyme. 1 for the door, 2 for the bed, 3 for the song you'll sing when you're dead. The milkman laughed it off as mischief, but later that day the seamstress who worked above the bakery was gone. Her shop was undisturbed, a dress still in the frame where she had been fitting it that morning. The button pinned to the note matched the ones she used for her winter cloaks. By the end of the week, 2 more rhymes appeared. One tied with red thread to the handle of the church door, another pressed under the lid of a water pump in the square. Both spoke of numbers and endings, their tones sing-song, but their imagery wrong in a way no child's hand should know. The second note mentioned a mouthful of dirt and a song in the bone, and by the following Sunday a farmhand from the outer fields had vanished, last seen heading toward the Velton side of the road. The constable, wary of stirring panic, collected the notes but told no one of their content. Behind the walls of the Velton estate the rooms were warm, the lamps burning low even in daylight. Alaric kept his study locked, a place no servant dared enter, while Prudence spent hours in the nursery with the children. There the air smelled faintly of wax and lavender, a mixture that masked something sharper beneath. The children played games that required no toys, only their voices and the rhythm of their rhymes. Sometimes they would pause mid-verse, their eyes turning to the door as though listening for something beyond it, then resume as if nothing had changed. The garden, even under frost, remained neat, the soil tilled in careful rows despite nothing growing in winter. A gardener had once worked here, but he had left abruptly the previous spring, saying the ground was too busy at night. No one asked what he meant. The Veltons tended the garden themselves now, their hands unsoiled, their tools always clean. It was easy in those early days for the disappearances to feel like misfortune. Winter was cruel, roads were treacherous, and people went missing often enough in rural places. But for those who passed near the Velton gates, there was an added unease. The iron bars were always shut, yet one could hear faint recitations drifting from the house. children's voices weaving lines about falling, burying, and keeping still. It wasn't the content alone that unsettled me. It was the precision, the way each syllable seemed placed with the care of a needle through cloth. These were not rhymes learned in the village school. They were taught for a purpose. When the constable finally decided to question the family, he found them gracious, even welcoming. Alaric offered tea, Prudence served biscuits, and the children stood in a row, reciting a verse about guests who go but do not leave. Their calmness was disarming, their manners impeccable. No search was made that day. The constable left with a polite nod and a quiet mind, though the verses would return to him later, unwanted as he tried to sleep. In Harrow's End, life moved on. But in the spaces between, in the corners of the streets and the edges of thought, the rhymes lingered. More notes would appear, more people would vanish, and though no one dared say it aloud, the trail led always back to the house at the edge of rhymes. The winter deepened, and the soil in the Velton garden never seemed to freeze. The Veltons had perfected the art of appearing harmless. To a stranger, they were the kind of family one might expect in an illustrated children's book. Neat clothing, pale but clean faces, hair brushed into smooth parts. Yet nothing about their voices was natural. Every word, from the simplest greeting to the most mundane observation, emerged in rhyme, as if prose were a language they could no longer speak. It was not the playful, spontaneous rhyming of children, but something deliberate, as though each phrase had been rehearsed long before it was needed. Neighbors told themselves it was a harmless quirk, perhaps a game the family refused to outgrow. But no one could recall hearing them laugh. Their rhymes were not accompanied by smiles of amusement, but by a measured stillness like the careful turn of a key in a lock. Alaric Velton was a man whose eyes never wandered. When he spoke, his gaze fixed on the listener as if weighing the worth of their response. His rhymes were slow, exact, and heavy with meaning that didn't belong to the words themselves. Prudence, in contrast, moved through the village with a softness that made her presence difficult to place. She could pass within arm's reach and leave nothing but a faint sense that she had been there. Her rhymes were gentler, almost maternal, though no less unsettling. The children, Elspeth, Owen, and Ruth, spoke in high, clear voices, their verses often about objects or events no one else understood. A rhyme about a blue-eyed lamb in a locked shed might follow a missing pet notice pinned in the market square. The connections were never proven, but they were whispered about with unease. It was in early February when the seamstress vanished. She had been well liked in Harrow's End, a young woman named Lorna Wykes who prided herself on fine, intricate stitches. That morning she had carried a parcel of freshly tailored garments to the Velton estate, a winter coat for Prudence, the matching waistcoats for the children, and a heavy wool jacket for Alaric. She was seen walking up the long path to their front door, her breath clouding in the cold air. The delivery should have been routine. By dusk, she had not returned. The following day, her small shop remained locked, her personal belongings untouched. When questions arose, the Veltons answered them with ease. Yes, they had received their garments. Yes, the seamstress had left their home unharmed. Alaric's voice, steady and without inflection, carried a rhyme about a needle that rests when its work is done. Prudence followed with a softer verse about warm hands in the winter sun. The children chimed in together, their tones too even for their age, speaking of buttons that bite and thread that sings. No one knew how to respond. The words did not feel like lies, but they did not feel like truth either. 3 days later, a single piece of cloth appeared in the churchyard, pinned to the back of a wooden pew. It was a scrap from one of Lorna's sewing projects, a deep green fabric embroidered with a child's careful stitching. The words formed a short poem, One for the coat, one for the skin, one for the mouth you'll never open again. The stitching was uneven but deliberate, the letters slanting upward like a child trying to imitate an adult's hand. The color of the thread was wrong. It was not a dye Lorna ever used. It was darker, with a faint brown cast that deepened toward the knots. The constable took the scrap without comment, but his face was pale when he left the church. In private, he wondered if the thread could be human hair. He told no one of the thoughts. Instead, he kept watch on the Veltons from a distance, though they gave him nothing to act upon. They still walked into the village together, always in clean, pressed clothes, always reciting their rhymes as if carrying on a conversation only they could understand. The whispers grew. Some said the family had been cursed. Others claimed they had cursed themselves. There were stories, too, of old customs in the northern counties, of families who bound their speech to ritual patterns to keep certain spirits from entering their homes, or to keep something worse from leaving. Whether the Veltons followed such a practice out of belief or out of something darker, no one knew. But the more one listened, the clearer it became that the rhymes were more than words. They were a structure, a pattern woven so tightly around the family that nothing could pass in or out without being shaped by it. Late in the month, a neighbor swore she heard singing from the Velton garden after midnight. Not the high, light tones of children at play, but a low, droning verse repeated in perfect unison. She could not make out the words, only the rhythm, 3 beats. Then a pause, 3 beats again, like the measured turn of a wheel or the soft clicking of shears. By morning, the garden looked untouched, its neat rows of soil unmarred by footprints. But for those who had begun to pay attention, the quiet perfection of the Veltons' world was starting to feel less like order and more like control, the kind that leaves no trace until it is too late. And somewhere, perhaps not far from that tidy garden, the thread from the seamstress's final work was waiting to be used again. The first body did not look like a killing at all. It was found in the pale light of early morning, lying in the frozen grass of a fallow field just past the main road to Harrow's End. The farmhand was a broad man named Stephen March, known for his temper and his fondness for the alehouse. But the scene around him was silent, too clean for a drunken accident. His eyes were half open as if caught mid-thought, and there was no sign of struggle in the frost beneath his boots. Yet there was something wrong with his mouth. At first, the constable thought it was frozen shut. Then, when they brought him to the coroner, the truth emerged. Every inch of his lips had been sewn together with an almost invisible thread. The stitches were tight, precise, not the crude work of an opportunist. They were the kind of stitches made by someone who had done this before. The thread was unlike any in the village. It was pale, nearly white, but with a faint sheen that caught in the lamplight. When the coroner examined it more closely, he said nothing at first. Later, behind a closed door, he admitted to the constable that it was not cotton or silk. It was made from hair, fine strands twisted together until they formed a cord strong enough to pierce skin. The hair had been cleaned, stripped of its color, but its texture was unmistakable. It was human. The strangest part was not the stitches, but the warmth. Stephen's body was still warm to the touch, though the coroner determined he had been dead for at least 3 days. There was no decay, no smell of rot, as though something had preserved him in that exact state. His blood had not thickened the way it should in the cold. It was as if his body had been taken from wherever it was kept and placed gently in the field only hours before it was found. Tucked inside his coat lining was another puzzle. A strip of fabric stitched into the seam, almost hidden from view. The stitching was childlike, uneven, and the thread was the same pale human kind that sealed his lips. The words spelled out in crude letters read, "Sing no more, the jar is full." The constable felt a chill at the phrase but said nothing, slipping the fabric into his pocket before anyone else could see. Word of the discovery spread quickly, though not all of the details were shared. Most in Harrow's End heard only that Stephen March had been found dead, and in a village accustomed to hard winters and sudden illness, death was no stranger. But those who knew the constable noticed a change in his manner, his way of glancing toward the Velton estate when the subject came up, as if measuring a distance in his mind. He had heard only weeks earlier the Velton children singing a rhyme about a mouth that kept the secret in while skipping rope in the square. At the time it had seemed odd, but harmless. Now the words returned to him with a weight he could not shake. Stephen had no known quarrel with the Veltons, yet he had worked the fields nearest their land. It was not unusual for him to pass by their gates at dusk. The constable thought about the way those gates never opened, and yet the Veltons were seen in the village often enough, their clothes always neat, their voices always in rhyme. He began to wonder if people vanished not because they entered the Veltons' home, but because the Veltons found them elsewhere, choosing the moment with care. The coroner, perhaps sensing the danger of saying too much, sealed the official report with vague language. Cause of death unknown, time of death uncertain. But privately he told the constable that he had seen marks on Stephen's chest. They were not wounds exactly, but faint impressions like something had been pressed into the skin repeatedly. The shapes were too symmetrical to be random, forming a pattern almost like a child's drawing of a wheel. The impressions had not broken the skin, yet the flesh beneath was bruised in a perfect circle, as though a heavy object had been used again and again, always in the same place. The constable tried to match the shape to anything he knew. Tools, household objects, farming implements. But nothing fit. The closest he could imagine was the rim of a small jar. He thought again of the stitched message. Sing no more, the jar is full. It was as if Stephen's voice had been taken, placed into something, and sealed away. The thought was absurd, but the more he turned it over, the more it clung to him. By the end of that week, the field where Stephen's body was found lay empty again. The frost covered any trace of the placement, and the village settled into its usual rhythm. Yet in the back of every conversation there was a new caution, a tightening of voices when certain names were spoken. And at the edge of town, the Velton estate stood as it always had. Silent, orderly, and untouched by the cold, as if the winter could not reach it. Inside, perhaps, the rhymes were still being spoken, each one a key to something no one dared open. The constable knew more would come. He did not know when, only that the next body would speak no more plainly than the first. The village green was still slick from a night of cold rain. When the Velton children appeared, their boots spotless despite the mud. They moved with an odd grace, skipping in unison as if their feet had memorized a pattern too precise to be mere play. In their hands they held a frayed length of rope, swinging it between them in a steady rhythm. A few other children joined in at first, laughing and stumbling as they tried to keep time, but the laughter faded when the rhyme began. In high, clear voices, the Velton children chanted about the girl who hid under the floor and the nails that would hold her no more. The verse repeated with small changes, each round adding a detail. The color of her dress, the way her hair fanned out like a net, the sound she made before she stopped moving. None of it rhymed in the playful way children's games should. The cadence was too even, too controlled, each word landing like the tick of a clock. A school teacher, crossing the green on her way to collect supplies, slowed her step. The description in the rhyme caught her attention, and she realized with a sinking feeling that it matched the last outfit worn by Lorna Wykes, the seamstress who had vanished weeks earlier. The bright buttons on the coat, the pale hem trimmed with lace, all named in the sing-song voices of children swinging their rope as if marking time between each breath. The teacher tried to interrupt, asking where they had learned such a song, but the Velton children only smiled and began the verse again, louder this time, drawing out the final line until it dissolved into a hum. That night, the teacher confided her unease to a neighbor, saying she intended to speak to the constable. She never had the chance. 2 days later, she was found dead in her small cottage. She lay in the washroom, her head resting on the rim of the basin, her eyes wide and glassy. At first, the scene appeared to be a drowning, but when the basin was emptied, there was no water. Instead, the coroner found her lungs packed with dry seeds, hundreds of them pale and smooth, clogging every airway. They were not native to the area, and no one could explain how they had been forced into her without tearing the tissue. The seeds were the kind that swelled when wet, and yet inside her they had remained dry, as though the air itself had been drained away before she died. The constable, summoned in the early hours, noted the neatness of the rest of the house. Nothing was disturbed. Her workbooks were stacked on the table, her pen still capped. On the floor beside the basin was a scrap of paper folded twice and smudged with damp from the air. Inside, written in a child's uneven hand, was another verse. 2 eyes to see, 2 hands to sew, but the mouth stays shut so nothing will grow. The writing was eerily similar to the stitching found inside Stephen March's coat. When he asked the villagers who had last seen the teacher alive, several mentioned the green that morning where she had stopped to watch the Velton children play. One of the younger boys who had joined in the skipping rope game said she had left abruptly after speaking to them. When asked what she had said, the boy could only shrug, repeating that she had looked cross and told the Velton children to stop singing about the lady on the floor. But they had not stopped. They never stopped unless they chose to. The constable found himself walking past the Velton estate more often after that. He watched the windows, saw the faint movement of curtains, and heard, just faintly, like a draft through the hedgerows, the rise and fall of voices in rhyme. Sometimes it was the children alone. Sometimes he thought he heard Prudence joining in, her voice lower, steadier, guiding the verse like a conductor with an unseen baton. Always the words seemed to circle back to the same imagery. Hidden places, sealed mouths, things planted in darkness. It became clear that these rhymes were not spontaneous play. They were records, committed to memory, sung aloud as a kind of keeping. Each verse seemed to preserve a moment of cruelty, embedding it in rhythm so it could not be forgotten or misunderstood by those who shared the pattern. The Velton children were not simply chanting for their own amusement. They were documenting, in plain sight, what others had worked to conceal, and those who recognized the meaning did not live long enough to speak of it twice. By the end of that week, the skipping rope lay abandoned on the green, its frayed ends trailing in the mud. The other children no longer joined in, though they still watched from a distance when the Velton siblings began their games. The chants were quieter now, but no less deliberate. The words just soft enough to force you to lean in, to listen. That was how they drew you closer, the constable thought. Not with threats, but with curiosity and the kind of innocence no one dared accuse of harm. And somewhere in that measured rhythm, behind the childish verses and the smiles that never reached the eyes, the truth of what had happened to the seamstress and the school teacher was held in perfect time, waiting for the next verse to begin. The visit to the Velton home was never meant to be a search. It began as a matter of form, a follow-up to the teacher's sudden death, an opportunity to check in without raising suspicion. The constable knew enough to request entry under the guise of returning a borrowed parish record. Prudence welcomed him with her usual quiet courtesy, the faint trace of lavender following her through the hall. The children watched from the stairwell, their hands resting on the banister. their lips moving in unison as though reciting a verse too soft to hear. Alaric emerged from his study tall and composed, speaking in the same steady rhymes that made conversation with him feel like stepping into a loop you could not break. The house was orderly, every surface polished, every picture frame aligned. But in the drawing room, behind a high-backed chair, the constable noticed something unusual, a cabinet he did not recall from previous visits. It was tall, narrow, and fitted with a lock that looked newer than the rest of the furniture. The wood was dark, but the grain was warped in a way that suggested the cabinet had been kept in a damp place before arriving here. When the constable asked about it, Alaric simply smiled and offered a verse about keeping the words in a safe place where they cannot run away. An excuse was made to fetch Prudence from the kitchen, and in that moment of distraction the constable moved closer. The cabinet gave off a faint vibration, almost like the hum of a tuning fork fading into silence. He tried the handle, locked. He could have left it at that, but something in the air around it felt wrong, heavier somehow. His hand lingered on the lock just long enough for one of the children to notice. Without a word, Owen disappeared up the stairs. Seconds later, Prudence returned with the tea tray, her expression unchanged. It was not until 2 nights later, when a magistrate's order was quietly obtained, that the cabinet was forced open. The constable and 2 other men were present. The lock snapped under the pressure, and as the door swung wide, the smell hit them, not rot, not decay, but a dense, cloying sweetness like fruit left too long in the sun. Inside, arranged on 4 shelves, were glass jars. Each was sealed with black wax, and each contained what could only be human tongues. They were suspended in a cloudy liquid, pale and distorted, the edges curled as though they had been torn rather than cleanly cut. Every jar had a label, not with a name, but with a short line of text, all of them nursery rhymes, each written in the same small, uneven hand. The labels read like fragments of games. Ring the bell when you come in. Count to 3 before you sleep. The bird won't sing if the cage is wet. None made sense on their own, but together they carried the same cadence as the verses the Velton children recited in the square. It was as if each rhyme in the village had its origin here, preserved in flesh and liquid. The constable realized with a cold weight in his chest that the rhymes were not just recollections. They were taken. These were voices made into objects. 1 jar on the top shelf was missing. In its place was a small scrap of paper pinned to the wood. On it was written, "The jar is out to drink the air." None of them understood the meaning, but that night, as the constable walked home, he could not shake the image of a mouth moving somewhere in the dark, still speaking even without a body to anchor it. The discovery was not reported publicly. The magistrate feared what panic it might cause, and the coroner, bound by an oath to the court, made no mention of the find in his ledgers. But secrecy did not mean safety. 2 days later, the officer who had physically opened the cabinet was found dead in his own home. Seated at his kitchen table with his head tilted unnaturally to one side, his jaw was dislocated, hanging at an angle that seemed to have been achieved with deliberate force. The muscles were torn, and the skin beneath his chin bore deep indentations as though something had gripped him from the inside and pushed outward. The Veltons, when asked about the officer's passing, expressed polite sorrow in their usual rhymes. Alaric spoke of doors that close when the night comes in, and Prudence added, "A song too loud for the singer's skin." The children remained silent, watching with that same fixed attention that made it impossible to know whether they were listening or recording every word. The cabinet was removed from the Velton home and locked away in a government storehouse miles from Harrow's End. But the hum it gave off seemed to linger in the constable's ears for days afterward, as if the sound had lodged itself beneath his hearing. And in the weeks that followed, more rhymes began to appear around the village, pinned to doors, tucked under bread loaves at the market, each one unfamiliar but carrying that same steady beat. It was as if the absence of the cabinet had not stopped the work at all. It had only made it harder to see where the next verse would be kept. The truth, when it surfaced, came from a woman most of the village had nearly forgotten. Agnes Hatherley had been a midwife in Harrow's End for more than 30 years before retiring to a small cottage on the moor. Age had made her voice brittle, but there was still a firmness to her gaze when she called for the constable in the spring of 1898. She said she had something to tell him about the Veltons, something she should have spoken of long before, but fear had held her tongue. What finally loosened it, she would not say. Agnes told him she had been present for the birth of each Velton child, not in the home's front rooms where neighbors might have been invited to call, but in a sealed chamber on the top floor, a place she had never been allowed to see except on those 3 occasions. Prudence had insisted the room be shuttered, its door locked from the inside, the air heavy with the scent of wax and camphor. In the corner, a phonograph would be wound and set to play the same lullaby on loop, a slow, winding melody sung by a child's voice, scratchy from the recording but strangely precise in its pitch. The song never stopped, not even as the contractions began, not even during the delivery. Prudence's instructions had been clear. No one in the room was to speak in plain language. Every word Agnes was required to say, about the mother's breathing, about the position of the child, had to be altered into rhyme. If she stumbled, Prudence would stop her with a sharp glance, and Alaric, who stood in the shadows, would quietly finish the line for her in perfect meter, as if he had known the words before she spoke them. After each birth, the newborn was placed in Prudence's arms, and before Agnes could clean or swaddle them, Alaric would lean down and whisper a short verse into the child's ear. Only then would the lullaby on the phonograph be stopped. When Agnes asked why such peculiar rules were necessary, Prudence told her, still in rhyme, that plain words make wild thoughts grow, and that the children must be kept in the pattern from the first breath. It was not superstition in the ordinary sense. The Veltons seemed to believe that speech carried something dangerous, that the disorder of normal conversation could allow something unwanted to slip in or out. By binding their children's voices to rhyme from the moment of birth, they were, in their minds, sealing them, making them whole in a way no outsider could understand. Agnes admitted she had taken the gold coins Prudence paid her and kept silent for years. But her silence had never been complete. She remembered after Owen's birth, hearing a faint tapping in the walls of the chamber, like small knuckles rapping in answer to the lullaby. It was not the sound of settling timber. It kept time with the music, and when the phonograph stopped, the tapping stopped too. During Elspeth's delivery, she heard it again, this time accompanied by what she swore was the faint echo of a voice, repeating the verses as they were spoken in the room. She could not tell if it came from inside the walls or beneath the floor. The constable listened in heavy silence. Agnes spoke quickly now, as if afraid that saying too much in one place might draw notice. She had seen strange marks on the newborns, faint circular impressions on the soles of their feet, small enough to be dismissed as nothing but oddly placed birthmarks. Yet they were identical on each child, the same size, the same depth. She had touched them once, and Prudence had snatched the infant away so abruptly that Agnes's fingertips tingled for hours afterward. 2 days after giving her statement, Agnes Hatherley was gone. Her cottage showed no signs of struggle, no overturned furniture, no broken lock. Her bed was neatly made, her shoes by the door. On the kitchen table sat a single object, the phonograph she had described, wound and ready to play. The needle rested against the grooves of a cylinder, and when the constable set it turning, the lullaby began. Slow, winding, sung in the same measured tone Agnes had described. Halfway through, he heard a faint second voice joining in, not on the cylinder but somewhere within the machine itself, as though something were inside it, keeping pace with the song. The recording ended with a click, and silence settled over the room. Yet the constable could not shake the sense that the second voice had not stopped, only moved elsewhere, waiting for the next time the song was played. He took the phonograph as evidence, but already he knew it would not remain silent for long. And somewhere back in the Velton estate, the next verse of the pattern was already being spoken into being, each rhyme sealing something deeper, something that could not survive outside their chosen form. The killings began to follow a new shape, as if the Veltons had shifted from preparation to collection. By midsummer, bodies were appearing at the edges of the village, always in places where the wind carried the sound of the Velton estate's garden. A low slope by the mill pond, the crest of a lane just beyond the hedgerows, the shallow ditch behind the church. The victims were not always dead when they were found, but they were always silent. Their mouths moved as if speaking, yet no sound emerged, only the faint rasp of air. The doctors soon understood why. Each had been stripped of their vocal cords, removed cleanly through a precise incision under the jaw. The wounds were stitched with that same pale, hair-bound thread. In their throats, the doctors sometimes found something left behind, a small wax cylinder no longer than a finger etched with fine grooves. The cylinders were sealed at both ends, as if whatever had been recorded on them was not meant to be heard, at least not by the living. But when one was taken to the magistrate's office and played on a borrowed phonograph, the grooves released the unmistakable sound of a voice. The first recording was of a man crying, the sobs broken by the rhythm of words. A verse short and clear, spoken in the same cadence as the Velton children's skipping rhymes. One breath for the jar, one song for the well, one voice for the dark where the others dwell. The voice broke before the final word, as if the speaker had been cut off mid-breath. Not all cylinders contained speech. Some held long silences broken by faint tapping like knuckles against glass. Others were filled with a single sustained note, held far longer than human lungs should allow. The doctors could not explain how these sounds had been captured, nor why the victims were found so soon after the recordings were made. The constable began to suspect the Veltons were not killing to end lives, but to preserve something, harvesting voices in the most literal sense, sealing them into these wax prisons as part of some ritual he still could not understand. It was a traveling actor who first recognized one of the rhymes. He had come to Harrow's End for the summer fairs and stayed in the alehouse long enough to overhear the whispers about the Velton killings. When the constable described the verse on the first cylinder, the actor's face had gone pale. He said it was nearly identical to a banned execution chant from the 17th century, a ritual once performed in secret gallows to call the soul forward before the body was dropped. Such chants had been outlawed for centuries, their practice punishable by death, but the actor swore some families in the north had kept them alive, weaving them into songs and games so they would never be forgotten. The constable could not ignore the pattern any longer. Each rhyme recovered from the cylinders matched the peculiar structure of the Velton's speech, and the dates of the killings seemed to follow a strict cycle, each one occurring exactly 13 days after the last. The numbers had been there from the beginning, hidden in the verses the children sang in the square, disguised as counting games and weather rhymes. It was as if the family was working to complete a set, each victim a required piece in a design no one else could see. The more the constable learned, the more he feared that stopping them might be impossible without first understanding the end they were working toward. But those who got close to the truth did not survive. The magistrate's clerk, who had been tasked with cataloging the cylinders, was found slumped over his desk one morning, his mouth wide open and his tongue rigid, as if frozen mid-word. His death was ruled as natural by those who preferred not to see the connections. But the constable knew better. The clerk had been overheard humming one of the Velton verses the day before. The villagers began to avoid the Velton children entirely, crossing to the other side of the street when they saw them approach. Yet the voices still spread. Children from other homes began reciting rhymes they could not explain, claiming they had woken with the words already in their heads. The constable feared that the Veltons no longer needed to speak to pass on their verses. The voices they had taken might still be moving among the living, using any willing tongue to carry the pattern forward. One evening, as he passed the garden wall, the constable stopped at the sound of faint music. It was not the lullaby Agnes had described, but a layered murmur. Dozens of voices speaking at once, each at a different pitch. Their words weaving in and out until the rhythm settled into something almost like breathing. He could not tell if the sound came from the house or from the ground itself. And when it stopped, the silence was worse, heavy with the knowledge that the next verse was already forming, and that another voice would soon be taken to complete it. They found Elspeth Velton at dawn, bareheaded in the lane, her nightdress hem soaked with dew and her hands folded as if in prayer. She was 8 and very quiet, the kind of quiet that makes adults lean down expecting shyness. When the constable spoke her name, she looked past him toward the ridge where the Velton house sat and recited a small verse about a hollow under the cradle and a lullaby that never tires. The words were simple, but her eyes were not. They held the fixed calm of someone who has learned to wait while others pretend not to hear. In the station's back room, she watched dust turn in the window light and counted each slow spin with the tap of a fingernail. She did not ask for her mother. When the magistrate's wife offered warm milk, she tilted her head and murmured a rhyme about milk that curdles if you speak plain nearby. The woman stepped back without knowing why. The constable, remembering the sealed birth room and its rule, let silence do the work. He set paper on the table. Elspeth drew a circle, wrote the number 13 in the margin, and set the pencil down with care. The constable took 2 men and followed Elspeth through the wet garden to the nursery. Sun fell through lace curtains onto a room arranged for gentle living. A cradle near the hearth, folded blankets in a careful stack, a shelf of wooden animals whose paint had not chipped. Elspeth touched the cradle's leg and lowered her hand to the floor. The hearth tiles were warm, though no fire burned. The constable pressed his palm to the boards and felt a faint vibration like breath moving under wood. They pried the boards and lifted a square that fit so cleanly it seemed made to return without trace. Beneath lay a thin chamber tracing the nursery like a shadow, not high enough for a man to stand. Lantern light slid down and found a row of tiny rocking chairs arranged in 2 perfect lines, each carved for a toddler's size, each runner cut with a narrow groove. No dust lay on the seats. There were stains instead, rust-dark in ovals the size of a child's weight settling and being lifted again, a patient pattern repeated until the wood remembered. At the far end stood a low lectern. On it lay stiff cards, yellowed at the edges, numbered in the corners. Each card carried a few rhymed lines in the same uneven hand that had labeled the jars. 13 breaths for Mother's bell. Rock to the left until the drum stops. Fold the tongue and tuck it in. The constable read and felt his throat tighten as if the words were not instructions but a habit his body already knew. Beside the card sat a child's music box with its key wound hard, the metal warm to the touch though no one had turned it. They brought Elspeth to the open floor and asked nothing. She looked into the lit space and began to hum, soft at first, then steady, and as the tone settled, one chair moved by the smallest measure, a breath's width forward and back, keeping time with her. She said in her clear, small voice that mother's song kept babies from learning the wrong shape and father's harvest fed the house when the song grew thin. She added that the chairs creaked less when the jars were full and sleeping in their dark. No one moved. The constable climbed down and touched a chair with the back of his hand. The wood held warmth that did not come from the lantern. It ran through the runner into the floor, a faint line that seemed to travel under the walls toward the study where Alaric kept his lockbox. He pictured stops along that line like bell mouths in an organ, each taking breath and giving back tone. Elspeth watched him and, without prompting, recited a brief verse about counting to 13 and keeping the verses smooth so the house would not cough. They carried the chairs out one by one, and the room did not feel emptier. It felt more awake, as if removing weight let something rise that had been pressed flat. Elspeth sat on the nursery rug, tracing circles and starting over whenever she reached 13. Prudence did not come home. A neighbor claimed she had seen her in the back field with a bundle against her chest. By dusk, Alaric stood in the doorway, looked down at the lifted boards, and offered a level rhyme about order keeping children safe from noise and strangers. The words were mild, the air was not. Elspeth went quiet when the last chair crossed the threshold, and somewhere deep in the house a latch settled with a polite click, as if a distant room had finished deciding. She whispered that mother's song was tired now and father's jars were hungry, and that taking the chairs would make the verses snag. Then folded her hands and watched the empty cradle as if waiting for the blanket to rise. Night gathered at the windows. The constable sent a boy for a cart and did not look at Alaric, who had begun to hum a counter melody too low to place. They sealed the opening and stood in the hall listening. The house was very still, but the stillness felt deliberate, like someone holding breath. Elspeth pressed her ear to the wall and said she could hear the song continuing under the plaster even without the chairs. Softer now, but exact in its count. The constable wrote her words in plain script and felt a tremor that did not stop when he capped his pen. The pattern had lost its furniture. It had not lost its voice, and the next verse would ask to be fed. The first sound rose just after midnight, a thin ribbon of voices drawn tight enough to cut, drifting from the Velton house and carrying over frost-stiff hedges like breath on glass. And those who woke thought of a kettle left to scream until they heard it divide and layer. Many mouths speaking in the same slow meter, each line entering exactly where the last one fell away. A discipline no chance chorus could hold. The constable stood in the lane and felt the hair on his arms lift as if the air had been combed by static. And in that charged quiet he understood why no one had ever truly caught the family in the act, because the act was not a moment but a machine, a score written into timber and lime. And while the village listened from their beds, the house kept time with itself and fed on the sound it made. And when he reached the door with 2 men and a lamp, the latch yielded without protest, as though the lock had learned hospitality, and the voices slipped back a room as politely as a host moving ahead to light the next candle. The parlor was neat to a fault, the kind of clean that makes a surface look unused, and yet when he pressed his palm to the wall he felt a faint tremor. Not the wobble of a loose panel, but a pulse that rose when the verse rose and fell when the verse fell, bright, and a seam along the chair rail gleamed where fresh putty had been smoothed thin as breath. So he nodded, and the pry bar bit, and the wood came away with a smell like damp linen, and behind the panel lay a narrow cavity boxed between studs, its edges rubbed to a satin dark by many careful hands, and set along its back were dolls the size of toddlers, with bodies cut from stitched human skin and heads of porcelain painted with simple faces that tried to be kind and failed. Each mouth a ring of wax fitted around a small metal reed, and when the chorus outside the panel swelled, the reed trembled and gave a soft answering tone that tucked itself under the larger sound like harmony. and the constable saw at once that the dolls were not keepsakes but instruments, and that the home had been tuned the way a chapel is tuned, with chambers and stops and bellows hidden where no guest would think to look. They moved deeper, and the voices moved with them, never nearer than the next threshold, never absent. And in Alaric's study the desk sat stripped except for a blank ledger and a key perfectly centered as if to teach the eye about balance. And behind the bookcase a dark smudge marked plaster at the height of a man's chin, a place worn by years of breath. And when the case came forward, a drilled aperture showed a shaft no wider than a wrist falling through the wall like a throat, and the chant sharpened a half step as air found it. And the constable pictured the shaft branching under floors toward the nursery and the garden and the storehouse where the cabinet now slept, a rootwork of passages mapping the pattern across wood and earth so that the house could drink from every room at once. In the nursery, the cradle rocked once in greeting and settled with an exactness no draught could shape. The wallpaper lambs bore tiny penciled numbers on their backs, counting to 13 again and again until graphite had cut faint grooves in paper, and a closet yielded folded blankets with hems stitched into couplets naming sleep as gate and breath as tithe. And under the hearth tiles a neat slot waited to hold a cylinder the length of a finger, its sides polished by many insertions. And he understood how a lullaby could travel through stone and return with something inside it that was not there before. They followed the strongest line to the long wall that faced the garden where plaster bulged in regular lozenges like ribs, and the pry bar opened a vaulted crawl that ran the length of the house, shelves cut into its sides and cords strung in clean angles. More dolls waiting with heads tilted toward thin glass tubes sunk into the studs. Tubes that did not look outward but inward as if the wall itself were a lung. And a dew gathered along their inner curve whenever the voices crested, trembled, and crept, and the constable remembered the wax cylinders carved with grooves and thought these tubes were the wet mold and the verses were the pressure. And what pressed through became a record not on wax alone but in the building, and at the far end of the crawl hung a wooden mask without features, its mouth an open circle fitted with a metal tongue, and on the floor a bellows breathed in shallow strokes without a visible hand, taking small drinks of air and returning them to the mask which turned them to tone. He ordered holes stopped and tubes stuffed with rags, and the chant faltered, clutched, and thinned, but it did not die because a new line woke somewhere beyond the house in answer like a far bell replying to a nearer one. A beat late, and he knew then the pattern had been laid in more than timber and lath, that it ran under the lane to the pew where a poem had been pinned, out to the field where Stephen March had been set to cool, through the storehouse where the cabinet hummed under canvas, and along the hedgerow path where children had kept rope time for the verse about the girl under the floor, and he felt the weight of a map too large for one light to show. The men lowered their lamps, and the frost crept back over the path like a lid, and the constable wrote in plain script because rhyme had no right in his book, and still his pen wanted to make beats. And he looked at the ledger on Alaric's desk and saw its purpose was not to record, but to train the hand until the measure moved the body, and he closed it and left it closed, and behind the sealed panels the house held its breath the way a singer does before the next line, and somewhere in the wires and cavities a second voice cleared a place for itself, and the sound that returned to the lane was thinner now but exact, a promise that the next verse would come even if the walls had to learn a new mouth to say it. The house did not stop singing when Alaric died. It only changed key, a thin metal note running through the walls as dawn dragged pale light across the study where he sat upright at his desk, chin lifted like a man catching a last instruction. The ledger lay open, the final page covered in neat couplets that ended with a single short line written twice, first in ink and then in something darker. Before the 13th bell. The inked time on the mantel clock showed 12 minutes past 4. Yet the constable counted 12 slow ticks and heard a faint 13th under them, a ghost beat that did not come from gears. Alaric's skin was cool but not stiff, his eyes clear as if emptied, and when the coroner's hand pressed gently to the ribs, a sound answered from the chest, not a heartbeat, but a precise mechanical clatter that clicked and whirred until the finger lifted. Beneath the sternum, the bone had been opened with care and resealed with fine stitches pressed flat to the skin, and under the seam a small, winding key lay sunk in the flesh, its slot polished by use. When the thread was cut and the ribs spread, the men fell quiet because the cavity did not hold a heart at all. It held a music box, brass teeth bright, cylinder scored with grooves, mainspring wound full. The box was coupled to a stiff reed that pressed the air where a heart should have moved it, and as the room listened, it played a thin lullaby that matched the one Agnes had described, steady and exact, each note measured like counting. The coroner's breath faltered as he traced the edge of the device and found tiny numbers stamped into the plate, 1 through 13 in a ring around the arbor. And he said through his teeth that the grooves were worn deepest at the first and the last, as if the song had been wound and unwound across many nights to mark the same span again and again. There was no blood pooled where a heart would bleed. What little lay in the cavity had been filtered through cloth and set back clear as tea, as if the body had been kept working just enough to carry the tune. A wire led from the box to the throat, thin as a hair, and the constable followed it to a neat puncture behind the jaw where it joined the small channel cut long ago for the cylinders. A path opened in a living man so the house could drink straight from the voice. On the desk a pen had dried against the ledger margin beside the last couplet, and when the constable read it silently, the room seemed to join him, the wall tone tightening until the air in the study felt like a lung in a held breath. Before the 13th bell, the line said, and then the ink had blotted as if a hand had jerked and steadied with effort not to smudge the count. The coroner said the device could not keep the body alive, only the rhythm, and that Alaric must have stood and wounded himself in the mirror with a practiced hand, turning the key in his own chest until the measure was full. The constable pictured that cold ritual, shirt folded aside, mouth shaping a verse while the spring took up slack, and he understood that what lay in the chair was not simply a dead man but a metronome the house had used to pace its work. He saw, too, how the family's long control over breath and beat had ended here, because the last lines showed the maker had tried to time his own end to the cycle and failed, writing death into a verse as if a planned cadence would make it kind. The cylinder in the box sang on in small metal teeth until the coroner's hand stopped it, and the instant silence that followed felt heavier than the song, like dirt pressed flat by a spade. In the grate lay a drift of gray that was not ash from coal. Sifted, it showed the faint grit of bone and the black flecks of wax, the residue of many cylinders melted and poured again. The window latches were scorched by a hot draft that had never burned curtains, a careful heat trained to pass through and leave no flame. A drawer held keys filed down to wire lengths and labels for jars that named no people, only tasks. Hold breath, keep count, mute echo. The constable closed the drawer and felt the desk hum through the wood into his fingers, a small line feeding back from hidden work still ongoing behind the plaster. When he turned his head, he saw Elspeth in the doorway with her fingers on the frame, eyes steady, lips moving without sound, as if she were counting rooms instead of numbers. She watched the key lifted from her father's chest and blinked once, not in shock, but in recognition, like a child seeing a tool return to its place. The men carried the body to the table and the music box slowed without a hand upon it, its spring surrendering time like breath after a held verse, and the last note did not fade. It stopped clean at the measure's edge and left a cut shape in the air. In that shape the house made a new sound, a dry whisper of draft drawn through a narrow throat, and the constable thought of the hidden shafts mapped the night before, the dolls with reeds in their mouths, the tubes that filmed with dew when the chorus rose, and he knew the structure would try to correct its loss by shifting weight to other parts. He looked down at the ledger again and folded the page gently over the line that had set the hour, and as he did, the room's tone wavered a half step, like a singer who had lost the pitch pipe but kept the will to sing. And he understood they had broken the metronome but not the choir. Outside, frost waited, and a dry spark dreamed in the walls for release. The fire began without flame in the eyes of those who saw it first, a shimmer above the roofline like summer heat, though the night was brittle with frost. And by the time the constable reached the lane, a dull orange lived behind the nursery windows, while the rest of the house breathed smoke through its seams as if the walls themselves had learned to exhale. He thought at once of the cylinder inside Alaric's chest and the way the song had stopped, and he knew some other machine had taken up the count, because the blaze did not climb or wander. It moved in measures, spilling across ceilings and drawing back on a pause, then pushing through again along neat lines as if guided by verses the fire somehow obeyed. And when the men broke the front door, the hall coughed black and then steadied, a corridor of heat that allowed them through with a narrow margin like a throat making room for a swallow. And the floors did not groan the way living timber cries, because so much of this wood had already been taught to make sound without complaint. The study burned hot enough to blister brass, and yet the ledger lay closed where the constable had left it, its edges singed but the last page intact, and he felt the insult in that, the way the house preserved the book that taught the hand to keep time, a teacher saved by the student as a courtesy. And beyond the study, the parlor walls fell open to reveal cavities of dolls reduced to pale slag around metal reeds that still rang faintly when a draft passed. Small notes like teeth chattering in a fever, and the men covered their mouths with wet cloth and moved toward the nursery because the blaze refused to take that room, ringed it instead with a brightness that licked the threshold and drew back as if checked by a line. And when the constable stepped over it, the temperature dropped as if he had entered a cellar. The air close but breathable, and the wallpaper lambs stared with gray eyes now, their penciled numbers visible under soot where heat had lifted the paste and bared the graphite grooves. The cradle stood uncharred, its runners clean, and the patched square in the floor the men had sealed days earlier remained flush. But the board lengths around it showed faint letters burned into their grain, lines of verse that had not been inked or carved, only pressed in by time and weight until the heat made them show. And the constable read enough to know the nursery had been both stage and press, a place where action forced words into wood until the song could be lifted like a print and carried elsewhere. Against the far wall, a trunk sat with its leather straps pulled tight and a dark sweat beading at the seams, and when he laid his palm to the lid, he felt a living warmth, not the sharp heat of flame, but the heat of work, like a small animal under a blanket. And he cut the straps with his knife and opened it and saw rows of wax cylinders bedded in dry wool, each one capped in black. And when he lifted the nearest, his fingers came away shining as if the surface had only just cooled. And he knew with a clean, deep certainty that someone had recorded in this room after Alaric's death and before the flames, maybe within the hour. Maybe while the men ran to fetch water because the grooves were soft at their edges and the smell was sweet and new. And below the first layer lay others, some labeled in the small, uneven hand the village now feared, and some blank as if waiting to be named. He told the men to pass the trunk out the window to the yard, and they did, though the sash was warm enough to burn skin, and when the trunk touched frost, the lids of several cylinders jumped with a tiny, dry click like knuckles tapping a table, then lay still. In the corridor, a beam sighed and dropped, but the nursery walls held, and he understood the house had been built to protect this room above all others, a vault made of rhyme and habit, and that the fire was not an accident or a fit of grief but a controlled purge to erase the parts that could betray the method while sparing the mouth that could start it again. Prudence was nowhere. Elspeth and the others had been moved before the first spark, and in the kitchen a ring of scorch traced the outline of a bellows left open, its leather dried in a flower of heat. And near it the faint outline of feet that had stood in ash without shifting. Heels narrow, toes straight, the stance of a woman listening to something finish. When the roof at last gave way, the fall sent a breath through the house that made every tube in the walls wet itself with dew for a heartbeat and then boil it off. A hiss rising like a last verse held too long, and the men dragged what they could into the yard while the constable watched the nursery door glow and dim on the beat, unwilling to cross again now that the room had shown him its priority. And he recognized the pattern of a retreat written on the walls by fire, a map of spared and taken, and he saw the thin channels the flames had followed and the clean squares they had left. And he thought of fields burned to drive out pests while the seed remained safe in a jar, and he knew the cylinders were the seed. Dawn found only a spine of chimneys in a child's room standing like an answer no one wanted. And on the lane frost steamed around the trunk while the lids cooled, and the constable set his hand on the wood and felt the faintest hum. Not sound, but pressure, as if the words inside were leaning against their prisons waiting to be chosen. And he told himself the next hours would be plain work of inventory and law. Though he understood plain work had never been enough here, and when a joist settled behind him the sound came in 3 beats and a pause. Patient still, counting its way through the ruin toward whatever voice would open the lids and let the pattern breathe again. In 1924, the matter returned as a ledger line, a quiet mark inside a Home Office review of old deaths and missing records, and far from Harrow's End. A London archive clerk lifted a crate with the wrong district seal and read the label. Velton cylinders, sealed by order, 2 signatures to open, and the signatures arrived from people who had never heard the name. An auditor named Ellen Braithwaite who trusted paper more than memory, and an engineer named George Hobson who trusted mechanisms more than men, and together they broke the wax on a morning that smelled of coal and old soap and found inside a nest of wool. Black-capped cylinders bedded like eggs, each tagged in a child's uneven hand with short verses and numbers that counted to 13. And the tags were brittle, but the wax felt fresh at the edge as if a warm thumb had pressed it yesterday. And because the inquiry was about procedure and not ghosts, they carried the crate to a small lab with a door that stuck at the hinge and a window that saw a wall, and added a stenographer and a watchman to make the number 4. And the engineer dusted the horn of the phonograph, wound it, set the needle, and lowered the first groove into motion while the auditor kept her pencil ready for dates and locations, the way one might prepare to weigh grain. The first sound was breathing counted with care, soft and steady to 12 and then a held hush instead of 13, and when the breath broke a voice entered with the rhythm of the Velton rhymes, not sung but spoken as if obeying a rule. And the stenographer wrote the words and her hand shook and left a smear in the margin like a wet thumb. And the auditor noted the date etched into the cylinder's rim, a neat 1898 cut by a tool that did not slip, and she matched it with a death docket from Harrow's End, and nodded, as if an answer had arrived where a question once sat. But the next cylinder bore a rim date that did not fit the burial it named. The year set 2 winters later than the grave, and when the engineer played it, the voice sounded like a woman in a narrow room talking to keep stillness away, counting to 13 and starting again. And there was tapping in the pauses, a measured knock that traveled like pipe sound. And under the knock a faint second line as if a wall learned to echo. And the auditor kept writing, and the stenographer pressed the page to stop the tremor in her hand. They opened another and found a single held note carried far beyond a living lung, a tone that swelled and thinned and never broke. and when it stopped, the room felt shaved of air, as if the horn had swallowed the breath of everyone present and refused to give it back. And the watchman, who had spoken little, stepped into the corridor and did not return for an hour. The engineer turned the device off and checked the bearing out of habit, then turned it on again because the work required it. And the next record held a child's cadence naming a chair, a cradle, a bellows, a mask, and the numbers ran in a circle and settled on 1, and the rim date was cut in 1901, though the docket for the speaker's body, a farmer's wife missing in the thaw, had been signed 3 months before the year began, and the auditor marked the mismatch in her book with a tidy cross as if the neatness could contain it. By midday, the lab had filled with a thin smell like warm wax and lavender, and the window glass hummed on certain vowels, and once the phonograph stopped. But the tone did not, a breath-long carry that seemed to live in the horn's throat before fading, as if the metal itself had learned a fragment of the song. The stenographer asked to be excused and did not explain the small drops on the page, and the watchman stood at the stuck door and listened with his jaw set, and the auditor said the recordings were evidence of improper handling of bodies, and the engineer said they were evidence of a system, and neither said what else the sounds could be because the inquiry had no form for that. They sorted the cylinders by handwriting and number and found a late cluster with tags in a steadier adult hand that still pushed the rhymes into strict meter, and the rims of those late pieces were cut 1902 and 1903, and one was cut 1904 in a stroke that wobbled as if the cutter's wrist had tired, and the names matched dockets long closed, and the auditor wrote that the dates appeared to have been added after initial capture and that labels were therefore unreliable, and the engineer wrote that the pattern of breath counts revealed a machine behind the speaker, likely a bellows or reed pump, and that the line hum at a constant pitch across the set suggested a fixed room and not open air, and their language was plain, and their bodies were not. That night the engineer woke to a slow counting sound in the boarding house wall and knocked the plaster and heard his knock return in 3s. And the auditor woke to silence so complete she rose and held her breath and understood she had been sleeping inside a count she could not hear. And in the morning they returned to the lab and played the final cylinder and found not words but the sound of a door opening and a soft chorus beyond it. Many mouths setting a measure and a single set of footsteps crossing a board. And then a line spoken in a calm woman's voice that named nothing but time before the 13th bell. And the horn went still, and the watchman wrote the time in his pocketbook and would not look at the clock. And afterward the auditor locked the crate and signed a paper to move it to a stronger vault under a clause meant for state secrets. And the report that left the building spoke of mishandled exhibits and bad seals and suggested new rules for custody of dangerous phonographic records. And nowhere did it say what the room had sounded like or how the window had trembled, or that the voice that counted had made the breath of everyone present match its pace until the last number fell, and the crate left London in a van with no markings. And the engineer stood at the curb and watched the street take it and felt, with the plain certainty of a man who loves machines, that the pattern inside was not finished, only stored, and far from the city a small town still taught children to jump rope on a beat that did not quite belong to them. And the vault door closed on the cylinders with a sigh like a held note, and the inquiry moved on to other names as if names were the point, while in Harrow's End the ground over the old estate lay quiet, the frost unbroken, and beneath the chalk the air kept its count and waited for a hand to wind the work again. Which is what the law would do next without meaning to, and what the living would do because order must be kept. The case did not end. It cooled into rules, and people pointed to the rules instead of the house. Which is how a pattern like this prefers to live, hidden under good order and neat signatures. And in the years after the London Review, the cylinders slept under stone while ministries argued over forms, and a circular arrived that forced every county to keep phonograph evidence in locked vaults with 2 keys and a witness. And another act narrowed who could cut the dead and how far a private hand could go before the law took the body back. And coroners were told to write time of death by what the eye could prove and not by what a clock suggested. And archivists learned to mark custody in steps so fine the paper felt like skin under a blunt nail. And still none of that felt like an ending, because endings ask for a grave and a stone, and the town gave neither to the Veltons nor to those whose voices had been taken to keep the song smooth. Harrow's End put up no memorial, only a low fence where the estate had stood and a sign that said the ground was unsafe, and children played there anyway because the fence made a perfect line for games, and mothers called them away at dusk and did not explain the tight sound in their throats. And some nights, when fog washed the lane, a thin counting seemed to come from the hedge. Not a sound the ear could hold, more a pressure that made breath settle into groups of 3 and a pause, which is to say habit kept breathing even after the house was gone. The government sealed the crate in a deeper vault and wrote the word hazardous beside a number that meant nothing to anyone outside the room, and the report that moved through offices spoke of weak seals, mishandled exhibits, improper dates, and new custody rules, and never spoke of a window that hummed when certain vowels rose, or of hands that found they were tapping the table on a beat they had not chosen. And quite soon the case was taught as an example of best practice and not as a warning that speech can be trained until it owns the mouth that made it. It was easier that way. Years went by and people aged out of the story or moved away, and the men who had lifted the nursery chairs learned to sleep again as long as they kept a clock running in the hall. And the engineer who wound the horn in London took a job testing meter boxes and would stop when a device ticked 13s. And the auditor married and kept the habit of counting breaths while she walked the stairs. And none of them thought of themselves as haunted because they used plain language and kept busy. But the pattern did not need their belief. It needed only quiet places and a will to call order good. When the county finally cleared the rubble, they found blackened glass tubes fused into the plaster like veins and a child's metal reed welded to a nail, and a patch of floorboard with numbers risen out of the grain as heat drew up the graphite, and those items went to a small museum 2 towns away where they were labeled household curiosities of uncertain use, and school groups filed past them on wet mornings, and the guide told a soft story about strange families and old fears and how laws protect us now, and no one asked why the guide never stood too close to the case. In time, the county board voted for a garden on the site with hawthorn and a low stone seat, and a priest came and read names from old dockets, so the dead would not need the house to speak for them anymore, and a simple iron plaque set on the ground bore no verse, only dates and the line, "Do not let silence do the work." And that was the nearest thing to an answer the town could stand. Yet even with the plaque and the fence and the rules, parents kept catching snatches of old cadence in new places. A skipping song that turned on 12 and waited, a lullaby that held a last note too long, a habit of rhyming that ran through a classroom until the teacher clapped once, and the spell fell apart like dust in a draft, and the children could not say who taught them, which is another way to say the air had learned. The greater legacy lived quietly in files, sealed confessions from officials who admitted they had heard the cylinder speak beyond the needle. A clerk who wrote that she counted 13 breaths every night and could not stop. A watchman who begged to be posted where there were crowds, not halls. A local constable who said the house had been a machine made from people and rooms, and that he feared copies in smaller shapes would bloom where no one thought to look. Those pages were kept under clearance and brought out when committees debated new archives, and now and then a line from them slipped into law as a caution about ventilation, or about the length of songs allowed in certain wards, and no one noticed the strangeness because the words were dull and clean. What remained to learn was not technical, it was simple and hard, that evil thrives where speech is shaped until truth cannot fit inside it, and that a calm voice and a smooth pattern can carry harm farther than any shout, and that buildings remember the work we make them do, and that families can teach children to sound kind while training their breath for labor that looks like love. Perhaps the only defense is plain talk and stubborn listening, and a refusal to let a measure choose for us how long a note should last, and a habit of stopping when hands begin to move in time without the mind's consent. The story ends where it began, at the edge of a village with frost in the hedge and an empty field that looks safe because nothing moves and the rest is in us. The need to count, the wish to belong, the ease with which order feels like care when it is only in control. What do you think? Could this happen again?